Hello, Sophie here. I'm an illustrator, and I first started using Blender to create models and scenes to use as reference for my 2D work. I never intended to make any final pieces in 3D. Then I discovered grease pencil and I was hooked. Then came a few months of banging my head into a wall as I discovered this completely new software. But since that initial learning curve, it's been a true joy to use grease pencil. With this beginner tutorial, my hope is that it can help you to bypass that painful learning curve so you can just dive right into having a great time. This is intended for complete beginners to intermediate users, and even if you're more advanced, I hope that you can still learn some new tricks. Also, who doesn't want to make a 3D bonsai tree? So this is my final product of this tutorial, and here is my test project from back when I was just planning it. Fun fact, it is made completely with a mouse. So while I highly recommend a drawing tablet, even just a cheap one to get you started, this tutorial can also be followed with just a mouse. If you are able and willing to support me financially, the link at the top of the description box will take you to a Gumroad page with some bonus content. This includes download of my blend files and also this video. But what I am most excited about is you'll get access to a real-time version of this tutorial. It's the same information, but whereas this video is as condensed as possible and any clips of me working are highly sped up, with this other version, you can follow along with me in real time and we can work on our bonsais together. Eee. Cheers! I'll be using Blender 2.93 throughout this tutorial, and I'll have a pinned comment letting you know if any updates have resulted in a big change to the tutorial. If, throughout this tutorial, your file starts to get really slow, here's a quick tip that can help. By the way, if you're a complete beginner, this will sound like gibberish. That's okay, just make a note to come back to this timestamp if you need it. What we can do is add a simplify modifier, and then you want to check off this box so that it won't show up in the final render. You should be able to raise the iteration count to 3 without having it drastically change the look of your piece. And so what this does is it just reduces the vertex count, which is what usually helps me when my file starts to get slow. So fingers crossed that you won't need this trick, but you can come back to this timestamp when and if you do. So let's start by opening up a new 2D animation file. Now, draw a stroke. Woohoo! Isn't she beautiful? Now, before we start making magic, I'll give a quick introduction to Blender's interface. So here is what we'll cover. If this isn't your first time using Blender and you'd prefer to skip all that, you can head on over to this timestamp. So this big window is our 3D viewport. This is where we'll draw. Just underneath, we have the timeline, but we won't be animating anything today. The default shortcut is that when you press spacebar, your animation will start playing, so we could see on the timeline the frames are moving forward. And by default, auto keying is turned on, so this means that if we're on a different frame and we try to draw, it will create a new keyframe. So this is useful for 2D animation, but we won't be doing any of that today. And so we can just turn that off down here in the timeline by pressing on the dot icon so that it's no longer blue. Then I'll just select my new keyframe and delete it. And now if I draw, no matter where I am in the timeline, it will continue to draw in the same frame. To the right, at the top, we have the scene collection. This lists everything that our 3D scene contains. Right now, we just have our grease pencil stroke object and our camera. What the camera sees is what will become our final image, but we'll look at that more at the end. And so below that, we have the properties, which has a lot of different windows. Like most things with Blender, you don't need to know everything right away, and we are going to look at a few of them in this tutorial today. So right now, it's open to the active tool, and for us grease pencil users, this is where we can change our brushes and our colors. Another way to see the active tool is by using the shortcut N to make this window visible, and then we can find Tool just underneath Item. Grease pencil strokes exist in 3D space, so it's important you know how to navigate around the 3D viewport. You can move your camera with Shift and middle mouse button. You can zoom in and out with Control middle mouse button. You can also use the scroll wheel, and middle mouse button on its own allows you to rotate around the 3D canvas. But if you're using a pen pad, you may need to set a button to act as the middle mouse button. If you go into your tablet properties, you can see what buttons you have, and if none are set to middle click, you can see if there's one that you can change. Right click is also a really useful one to have because this is how you cancel something. And so if you only have one button, I think I would suggest having it be right click. Another option would be to go into Edit, into Preferences, and then if you go to Input, you can check the box that says Emulate 3-button mouse. So now you can hold Alt to make any click act like the middle mouse button. So Alt to rotate, Alt Control to zoom in and out, Alt Shift to move around. There is also another way to move around your 3D scene, and that is with these gizmos up here. So with this, we can rotate around our 3D scene. With this, we can zoom in and out. And with this, we can pan around the scene. Then we can hit numpad 0 or use this gizmo to return to looking at our scene through our camera. This white area is our camera area, and this is what will be rendered in our final image or animation. Let's start doing stuff. If you clicked on the timestamp and are just rejoining the group now, just make sure to turn off the auto keying function down here. Now, let's cover how to convert our grease pencil stroke into a mesh. So out of this single line, we'll create a tree trunk. First, we'll go into Object Data Properties, this green icon third from the bottom. This is where we find our grease pencil layers. Currently, the lines layer is selected, and that's where our line was drawn. So we can double click on the layer and rename it Tree Trunk. Now we're currently in draw mode within this grease pencil stroke. We can access all the modes up here. For now, let's go into object mode. Object mode allows us to select and switch between different objects in our scene, whereas the other modes are specific to the different objects. For example, if we select a grease pencil object and go to draw mode, we are able to draw within this object, and edit mode allows us to edit the geometry of an object. So now our grease pencil stroke is selected, and we can go into Object up here, go down to Convert, and convert it to a Bezier curve. This created a new type of object in our scene collection. And the name looks familiar, doesn't it? So it converted the active grease pencil layer, and so it converted our tree trunk layer because that is the layer that we had selected at the time. Now I can hide the stroke object up here in the scene collection by turning off the eye icon. This hides it from the 3D viewport, and the camera icon next to it determines whether it will show up in the final render. So I tend to click them both on or off at the same time. So let's select our tree trunk. Now I'll go once again into Object, Convert to Mesh. So yes, we converted it to a curve just because there's no direct way to go from grease pencil to mesh. But now we can go into edit mode of our new mesh. With the shortcut A, we can select everything And now we want to seriously clean up this mess of vertices. And so we can do that by going into Mesh up here, go to Clean Up, and select Limited Dissolve. Then open up this little box down here and click and drag on the max angle to increase it until there are about 10 or so vertices left. Then we can go into the Modifiers Properties tab over here. So grease pencil objects have a few modifiers specific to them, and meshes have even more. But today, we just want the skin modifier, which can be found under Generate. And then, up here, I'll go into solid view mode so that I have a better view of the form I just created. So we've created this mesh, but underneath it, we still have the same vertices exactly as they were. And so at any point, we can turn off or hide our skin modifier. So that's the beauty of modifiers. Unless you apply them, they're not permanent, and you can always return to how your object originally was. So now let's turn this into an actual nice tree trunk. No offense, mesh. So we can toggle X-ray mode up here. This allows us to see through our mesh at the vertices underneath. Then we can select individual vertices and move them around with G. So in order to resize the mesh, we can do this by selecting a vertex and pressing Ctrl A and dragging. Holding Shift makes this and any movement more subtle. And remember what I said earlier, right-click to cancel a transformation. So I'm liking this base for the trunk. So for the top, we can drag to select all the vertices within this box. And then to get a tapered top, we can do this with proportional editing. So I can turn that on up here. Then I can select the top vertex and resize all of the top ones. For mouse users, you can resize the radius of the proportional editing with the scroll wheel. And for pen pad users, you can use page up and page down. Then I'll play around with this a bit more, moving vertices with G, resizing the skin with Ctrl A, toggling proportional editing on and off with the shortcut O. And I think that's a pretty cute looking tree trunk. So now I can just turn off X-ray mode. So now that we've done all that, no better time to do the reverse, right? Now we'll be looking at converting this mesh into a grease pencil object. So in case I'm losing you, I find it easiest to make 3D grease pencil paintings when I have a base to build on top of. And since this isn't a sculpting tutorial, I wanted to share a simple way to get a mesh from a grease pencil stroke. But I promise, this is the last step before we actually start drawing. So let's go back into object mode. We have our mesh selected. Let's go back into object, convert to grease pencil. If this box isn't open, you can open it up. And we want to check the box that says keep original. For now, let's hide our tree trunk mesh and rename our new grease pencil object tree or bonsai. Now we can go back into object data properties where we have our layers, and we can see that a layer was created for both the fills. So this would be the faces of the original mesh and the lines. So the edges between those faces. So we don't want the lines layer. So I can select it and press this minus icon, and then I'll rename the fills trunk. Now let's go into the materials properties tab just below it. So when working with grease pencil, there are 3 kinds of materials that you can have. So we can have just stroke materials. So think lines, line art. We can have just fill materials. And we could also have a combination of strokes and fills. And then at any point, you can change a material setting and it will change all of the strokes in your scene that have that material. For today, we will mainly stick to fill materials for the trunk and stroke materials for everything else. So I'll keep our trunk as just a simple fill material. And then you can also give your materials a color. So let's change the base color of our tree trunk fill to something more tree trunk-y. I'm going a little purple because I wanna. So now we can start drawing. So let's select our grease pencil object and go into draw mode. For the branches, we'll draw using a stroke material. And so we can select the tree trunk stroke material, which is just a solid line. But we want to change the color so that it matches the trunk. So we can do this by pressing on the base color and using the eyedropper to copy the color of the tree. So now we'll go into Object Data Properties, press the plus icon to create a new layer and rename it Branches. Then one other thing to note is that down at the bottom, we have this section for strokes. And if we open that, we can see that the stroke depth order is currently set to 3D location. This seems to be the default whenever you convert a mesh into grease pencil. And if ever it's set to something different, just make sure that for you it is also set to 3D location. So stroke depth order affects how strokes are layered on top of one another. And this mode means that strokes that are closer to us in 3D space will appear on top of strokes that are further away. And we'll look at the other mode a bit later on in the video. Another thing I like to do is I like to go into this drop-down menu over here where we have our layers and to choose the option that says Auto Lock Inactive Layers. This makes so that I can't accidentally select and delete something from a different layer than the one I'm currently drawing in. And you can see as I toggle between these two layers as the lock icon locks and unlocks. Also, for this step, we'll stick to making strokes at full opacity. So let's change from the default pencil brush. You can change brushes just by clicking on the brush icon. And we'll use the ink pen brush. For pen pad users, the radius of the stroke will be affected by pen pressure. We can see that this icon up here, which has to do with pen pressure, is blue, meaning that it's active. But the strength is not affected by pen pressure. And we can very easily change the radius of our stroke with the shortcut F and then dragging to resize it. And then it's up here in this menu that we can change the stroke placement. And the first setting we'll look at is actually the last setting, stroke. So we get a list of targets and we'll look at them all. But once again, let's start with the last one, which is first point. And then next to that, we'll change the drawing plane to view. So how stroke placement of strokes works is that you build your strokes on top of other grease pencil strokes. In this case, we'll be building our branches on top of the tree trunk, and by selecting first point, this makes so that only the first point will stick to whatever grease pencil stroke is closest to it, and then continue freestyle based on from what angle you're looking at your scene. So we'll use this to start building the branches of our tree. So I recommend going into this with an open mind. Take your time. We're definitely starting with one of the more finicky drawing modes. And don't worry right now about how thin the branches are looking. Just focus on building up the branches for now. And I recommend rotating a lot to get a lot of three-dimensionality in your branches. And so really vary the angle from which you look at your tree while you're drawing. So something that's really cool about drawing with grease pencil is that there are all kinds of ways that you can modify the strokes. So earlier, I wasn't loving the shape of the tree, and so I was able to go into sculpt mode. And personally, I mainly use the grab and the push tools to move the strokes around. I guess the equivalent for a drawing program could be the liquify tool. And so for the tree trunk, I used the push tool, and I was really quickly able to change the whole shape of the tree. Another way to move strokes is in edit mode. Here, I personally prefer to use the lasso tool, so I can get that by holding down here and selecting it at the bottom of the list. And so I want to move these branches a bit further down the tree trunk. And so for this, I can press this second icon so that my selection will select strokes as a whole. So I don't need to go over the full stroke with my lasso for the whole stroke to be selected. And so I can very easily select and reposition these strokes with G and R to rotate. Also, I recommend erasing strokes in edit mode as well. Grease Pencil does have an eraser tool, but since our strokes exist in 3D space, I don't know, I find it tricky to erase only the exact strokes I want without having it overlap other strokes. Whereas in vertex mode, when you select something, you can see exactly what you get. And you can also select something, rotate to get another view, and shift select to add to your selection. And so when I want to do this, I typically press on this icon so that I select only individual vertices. And then I can just select and delete parts of my lines that I'm not loving. And of course, if you haven't already, make sure to save often. So once you're happy, we can start thickening the branches. So I'll go back into draw mode, back into the stroke placement up here, and now we'll change the target to all points. So now the strokes in their entirety will stick to whatever other strokes they intercept. This can get a bit tricky if your view of the stroke has it intercept with other strokes, and the stroke that you're drawing tries to stick to them. But like I mentioned earlier, I tend to just constantly be rotating around my scene, and so I usually catch them immediately and I just Control Z. You could also go into edit mode and select the stroke and delete it. So in this case, when you hit delete, you can go to the next option and delete the stroke as a whole, even if not the whole stroke is selected. So this does take a bit of thought and consideration and a lot of rotating around your canvas, but it's not too bad. And so I take this chance to get the branches to split seamlessly off from the tree and to get narrower as they extend out further. I'm liking it. So now, the only version of this stroke placement we haven't seen yet is endpoints. When you hover over it, the description is snap to first and last points and interpolate. So when I read this, I thought this would be perfect for adding vines to the branches. So let's see if I'm right. I'll create a new layer and call this vines. And then I'll start drawing. I think it does a perfect job of imitating a vine and swooping between two branches. The only thing is that, unlike the branches, we don't just want the vines to go off in any direction. They're suspended, so gravity should pull them down. So just try to make sure that you're looking at the tree from the side while you're drawing it. If ever you find the camera is in the way, you can always hide it in the scene collection. So I don't know about you, but I think these are some ugly brown vines, which means it's the perfect time to introduce you to our first grease pencil modifier. So let's go back to the modifiers tab and add a tint modifier, which can be found in the last category, color. Nothing happened. And that's because so far we've only been drawing with material colors. So remember, both the line and the fill material that we've used have this brown color. So these material colors are visible in solid view mode, which is the mode that we're currently in. But when we want to give our grease pencil drawing colors beyond just the material colors, we need to be in render view mode. So when you add a modifier, by default, it affects your grease pencil object as a whole. And so we can open up this section that says influence and have it influence just our vine layer. Now I can click on the color and find just a green that I like. And then we can play around with the strength slider. So I don't want my vines to stand out too much, so I'll keep the strength quite low. Don't forget to take a break if you need it, stretch, get some water, look out a window and give your eyes a break from looking at a screen. Continue this tutorial over as many days as you need to. I'm sure the lighting gives it away, but I certainly did not make this in one go, even though I tried to fool you by wearing the same shirt. The next stroke placement mode we'll be looking at is origin, and it has no subcategories, so you know it's gonna be simple. So, origin. What does that mean? To show you, I need to go back into object mode. The origin is this yellow dot. All objects have one. The camera, if I make it visible again and select it, has an origin. The origin is where in space the object is located. In this box, we can go to item. At the top, we have the location values along all of the axes, the rotation along all of the axes, and the scale as well. So this is different from going into edit mode and doing any of these transforms on the strokes within the object. The origin, as you can see, does not move. So only in object mode can you transform an object's origin. And then if you're internally gasping at this abomination, don't worry, you can reset everything by hovering over and backspacing. So when a new object is created, it gets created at the 3D cursor, which is currently invisible, but I can click that on if I open up overlays here and select 3D cursor. So by default, the 3D cursor is at the world origin. I can also click on all of the axes to show you that the world origin is where all the three axes, the X, Y, and Z, meet. So how is this useful for us? The origin can give you an anchor when drawing with grease pencil. Let's go back into draw mode. Remember, our origin is still at our world origin. And let's change the drawing plane to front. The front plane is along the X and Z axes. So we can see that with this gizmo up here. So now if we draw, two things happen. Our stroke is always along this front plane, no matter what angle we're looking at our scene from when we draw it. Also, it is always in line with the world origin. To help us see what we're doing, we can turn on a canvas that will show us the exact plane that we'll be drawing on. So we can do that in the same place where we made our 3D canvas visible. Down here in the section that says draw grease pencil, we can check on the canvas. And now we can see it's along the front in line with the object's origin. So I'll create a new layer for the leaves, and I'll also go into the materials properties tab. I'll press the plus icon to make a new material slot, and I can fill it by pressing on this icon over here and select solid stroke. We won't color this material. Instead, let's start looking at vertex paint. So we can turn vertex paint on with this icon up here. If we go back to tool, this has unlocked the color wheel and also this beautiful palette. Now select a green or whatever color you want your tree's leaves to have. And let's fill in the first layer of leaves, the leaves at the very center of the tree. Feel free to play around with opacity for this step. You can turn on pen pressure for opacity with this icon, and you can also change the opacity with Shift F and dragging. If you overlap multiple strokes that aren't fully opaque, you may get some weirdness. Kind of makes for an interesting dappled tree look, like the strokes are moving around and the leaves are blowing in the wind. Is that just me? I wasn't expecting this, but I'm kind of in love with it. Don't worry if, most of your branches aren't in line with your object origin. Just do however much makes sense for your tree. We're about to see a stroke placement mode. That's a lot more handy. No offense, origin. So one last thing. Whenever I use a color, I like to save it. So if I want to reuse it, I can find it again. I do this by pressing on the plus icon above the color palette. This adds the color to the bottom of the palette. Yes, now it's in my palette twice. But what's important is I know that every color at the bottom, past the dark blue, is a color I've used. And so, if you want to delete a color from your palette, you can do that with the minus icon. The next stroke placement down the list is 3D cursor. It also has no subcategories. Phew, it's almost as if we got the hardest one out of the way first. So while our origin is hidden in draw mode, our 3D cursor is still visible. If you didn't make it visible earlier, we can do that up here in overlays. Check the box next to 3D cursor. So this drawing mode works in much the same way, but the difference is that while you need to go into object mode to move your object's origin, moving the 3D cursor can be done without leaving draw mode. And it's generally not something that you want to do very often, move the origin, because if you have certain modifiers, this can affect them. The 3D cursor, on the other hand, can be moved around as much as you want. The shortcut to move the 3D cursor is Shift right click. But how does that work, moving the cursor in 3D space? It's a bit tricky, and I'm not a fan of just eyeballing it like this. So let's open up a new drawing window. And so what you want to do is up here between the 3D viewport and the scene collection, where their curved edges meet, right click and select vertical split, and then move it so that it splits down the 3D viewport. This awful looking dead tree is because by default it opened up into solid view. And remember, our leaves just have this solid stroke black material. So because this window is smaller, some of these menu items at the top are hidden. And so we can either scroll to get to the end and return to render view mode, or if you don't have a scroll wheel, you can also just hold the middle mouse button over here and drag. So while we're hovering over this new window, we want to hit numpad 0 to look at our tree straight down from the top. If you don't have a numpad, you can use the rotation gizmo and just press on the blue Z button. So why are we looking at our tree from an unarguably unappealing angle? Well, when you're just floating in 3D space and you place the 3D cursor, it can go a bit anywhere, but if you give it only 2 axes, you can know it will move only along those 2 axes. And so we are going to use the 3D cursor to draw the rest of the leaves. So in my main 3D viewport, I can Shift S at roughly the height that I want, and then in my second window, I can place it at different spots around the tree, and the height will not change. You can also hold Shift and right click to move it around. So now, let's look at what happens if we change the drawing plane to side. I mean, it's not a surprise what happens. The strokes will now draw along the Y and the Z axes. So now I can place the 3D cursor over here and draw some strokes on the far side of our tree. Before we move on, is anyone else as sick of these 2 boring colors as I am? I need some hue variation. We can do that up here to the right of the radius and strength in stroke, and then check the box that says randomize. Let's bring the hue value up, press this button to have it affect the stroke as a whole. And if you're a pen pad user, I recommend checking this box so that the hue randomization will be stronger the harder you press. And this means that you can make the value larger without having it feel too disjointed. If you're a mouse user, however, you'll want to keep the randomization value relatively small, between 0.2 and 0.4, I'd say. So now, let's place our 3D cursor here and do the same thing at the other end of our tree. I'm a big fan of scribbles, so I'll work those in as well. And then for this area down here, once again, I can move the 3D cursor height-wise in this window. And then with the second window, I can just make sure that along that height, it's where I want it. So we're starting to get some interesting looks from multiple angles. let's keep looking at the different settings. So we can change the drawing plane to top, move the 3D cursor to around the top of the tree, and draw some leaves at the crown of our tree. So that it doesn't get too repetitive looking, let's move the 3D cursor around quite a bit during this step. Alright, so the last drawing plane we haven't met yet is cursor. So let's see how this looks if we place the 3D cursor. Thank goodness we have the canvas, because this shows us that the drawing plane is whatever angle we were looking at our scene from when we placed the 3D cursor. This is really cool. For this to work best, I find it best to stay fresh, not stay in one area for too long. So now we're starting to get some really interesting variation in our work, but I struggle with how unpredictable the placing of the 3D cursor is. And using our second window doesn't really work, because then we get a drawing plane that's just along the top, and so I find that too limiting. But now, you've seen all of the different drawing plane options, so you can choose whichever one or ones you want to use to continue fleshing out your foliage. My personal favorite is to set the drawing plane to view, and to use the combination of the two windows to keep moving the 3D cursor and keep drawing strokes at different angles. Also, with view, once the 3D cursor is placed, we can still rotate around it, and you can see our canvas rotates with us, and we can use this to get even more variation. Don't be discouraged if the stroke placement is a bit tricky to get the hang of. I use Ctrl-Z a lot while I draw. Just go at it with an open mind and keep rotating as often as possible. I personally really like the combination of getting those big faded strokes, those medium opaque strokes, and also a whole bunch of scribbles. As I'm filling out the foliage, I also like to switch between 3D cursor and stroke placement with the target at first point. This can be especially useful if you notice a bare branch that you haven't managed to hit with your 3D cursor strokes. So far, we've seen all the drawing planes and 3 of the stroke placement modes. So that means all we have left is surface. We don't have a surface anymore. Let's get us a surface. First, we need to go back into object mode. We can hit Shift A and add a mesh, and we want to add a UV sphere. It got created at our 3D cursor, but that's fine. We're gonna want to move it anyway. To the base of our tree. My inspiration for making this piece was very much those little bonsais that you see growing out of a moss ball. So that's what this sphere will become. I'll go back into solid view mode up here to get a better view of it. When you press G to move something, or R to rotate, or S to scale, you can also press either X, Y, or Z to move that item along only that axis. So I can use Z to get it down to the height that I want. Then I can also use the shortcut Shift Z to move it along everything but the Z axis. So in this case, the Y and the X axes to reposition it without changing its height. So now, let's create a new grease pencil object. But unlike the sphere, which didn't matter where it was created, I want this new object to be created at the world origin. I can press Shift S and select Cursor to World Origin to move the 3D cursor back to the world origin. And so now, if I create a new object, that is where it will appear. So I'll press Shift A, and then in Grease Pencil, I want to create a blank. So Grease Pencil blank objects start out with nothing. So in Object Data Properties, let's click on New Layer and name it Moss. Then we need to go into the Materials, press the plus icon to create a slot, and in the icon next to New, we'll select the same solid stroke as before. Now, because it's a blank, there's nothing in the 3D viewport that you can select, So if you accidentally click out of the blank object, you just need to select it again in the scene collection. Speaking of, would also be a good time to rename the object as well. And so the shortcut to rename something is F2, and let's call it moss ball. Now, with it selected, let's go into draw mode and change the stroke placement to surface. This also comes with a setting, which is offset value. This is how far away from the surface the stroke will be drawn. So that's pretty far. Let's go with around 0.025. So stroke offset is weird, I'm not gonna lie. The offset is impacted by how zoomed in you are when you draw the stroke, meaning that it will change as you zoom in and out of your piece. That's an extreme example. So for really precise work, this can be a big bother, but what we're going for today, an imperfect little moss ball with a bunch of moss sticking out of it, it'll be perfectly fine. So let's scribble on some mossy details on the top half of our sphere. But for this new grease pencil object, let's approach it a bit differently. Let's create two separate layers, one for our thin strokes, our moss scribble lines, and another for our thicker strokes. So there's something different about this new grease pencil object, and that can be found down here, back in strokes. When you add a new grease pencil object, the default stroke depth order is 2D layers. This mode places strokes on top of one another based on, you guessed it, the order of their layers up here. So we can change the layer of the orders with these arrow keys to move them up or down. And this can result in a lot of different, really interesting looks. I think I prefer the scribble lines underneath the bigger strokes. I did the opposite for my test piece, so there's definitely no right way to do this. So I want the entirety of my moss ball to be green, of course. We could select the moss ball mesh and give it a material color, but what I don't like about this is that we can still see the shape of the mesh and the outline of the faces. And so I want this green area to be just a flat color. So I want to do like before and convert my mesh to a grease pencil object. But first, I'll press Ctrl A and apply all transforms. This places the origin of our moss ball back at the world origin. And then Object, Convert to Grease Pencil. And yes, we do want to keep the original. And now, I want this new fill layer to be in the same grease pencil object as my moss ball. So I can do that in this drop-down menu at the bottom, copy layer to object, and move it to the moss ball. Then I can delete the new grease pencil object I created. Now let's select our moss ball, go into the materials, and give this new fill material a color. And I want to go quite dark green for this. Now you may notice our scribble layer has disappeared. So when you move grease pencil layers to other objects, the layer appears just above whichever layer you had currently selected. So I had my scribble layer selected, and so it's just above that. And because the stroke depth order is set to 2D layers, it hides it completely. It would hide everything if I put it to the top of the list. So let's move it to the bottom. Looking great, but I do want to create one more stroke layer because the transition from dark to light, not that great. So we can create it just above the fill layer, and let's name this gradient. Now let's go into draw mode and make your brush huge. I'm actually going to turn pen pressure for radius off because I really want these strokes to be as giant as possible. But before you draw, up here shows us the material that we're currently using, and so it most likely got changed to the sphere fill material, and so you just want to change it back to the solid stroke material. And now I'm going to draw huge strokes at varying opacities to make the top half get progressively lighter. I also changed the stroke offset to 0.5 for this step. It was just feeling a bit too small. So it's really nice, but kind of a mess, right? Well, let me introduce you to the magic of layer masking. This is actually the biggest reason that we converted the sphere into a grease pencil object. So in our layers, we can check this box that says masks, open the drop down, and press the plus icon and select our fill layer. Woohoo! Ah, I am loving it. In this section, I'll be taking you along with me as I finalize this 3D painting because there is not nearly enough detail as I would like. I'll also be using a bunch of new grease pencil modifiers to get some really cool looks. Okay, first things first, this moss ball is seriously bumming me out. To start, I'm going to add a thickness modifier. Have it influence the big strokes layer, and then with this slider, I can make them a bit smaller. I'll be speeding quite a bit through the process, since it's all the same concepts as we've seen before. However, this is the step that I spent the most time on, so if you'd like to see that in full, you can check out the real-time version of this tutorial linked in the description box below. Kind of remind me of like shooting stars. And then I also want to add a color gradient to our moss ball, so I can do that with the tint modifier. And instead of a uniform color, I can set it to act like a gradient. Then you need to assign an object to act as the anchor for the gradient. And so I will select the tree object because the origin is just at the world origin. And so the gradient will radiate out from this point in 3D space. And then I'll make the closer color a limey light green. Play with the radius so that I can actually see it. And make the further color a darker green. I'll lower the strength of this a little bit, but I find it really helps to unify all of the colors. And then I don't think I want it to affect all of the layers. So I think I'll have it affect layers with a pass index of 1. And then over here in layers, it's in relations that you find the pass index. So I'll give a pass index of 1 to the big strokes, the gradient, and the fill layer. And then I'll draw some more details coming off the moss ball, some scribbles that leave the form, some bits of stringy moss, and also stems and leaves and maybe some flowers. And I'll do all this using stroke placement with the target at first point. And I'll make this in a layer at the top. I'm thinking it would be nice to also have this same gradient on the tree, but for it to do the reverse. So the lighter green would be closer to the center and the outer leaves are darker. So I can go into the scene collection up here, open up the drop down of the moss ball and open up the modifiers. And then I can find the tint modifier and move it to the bonsai object to copy it. Now I'll change the target and the influence to have it affect the tree as I'm envisioning. So looking at the tree, I think I'll mostly leave these two sections alone, but I want to fill in the space in the middle a bit more. And so I think I'll just draw in some vines, some leaves dangling, similar to the dangling shapes of the moss ball. I'm also going to add some details to the tree trunk, some ridges, maybe a bit of shadows to the underside. What if I had roots that went all the way through the tree? Noise modifier is the last thing that I wanted to add. So this is a really fun modifier for adding a bit of life to a still piece. So I can find it under the deform category. And then I'll set the position to between 0.1 and 0.2. And then I want it to influence everything but the fill materials because some weird stuff can happen in this case. And so I can just select the fill material and press on this icon to have it affect everything else. So now, there are just a few last things we want to do to make this a final piece that we can present and share. First, let's select our sphere and press S to resize it just a tiny amount. So even though we drew on the surface of the mesh with offset, there are still some areas where it intersects with the strokes, and this is especially apparent if we export. So you can see it doesn't look exactly like it does in the 3D viewport. And so I'll keep the sphere visible so that it hides the strokes on the other side. But with S, I can scale it down just a really small amount. And so now we want to export this as a turnaround animation that shows off all the beautiful angles of our bonsai. So let's press numpad 0, or we can also use this button to look through our camera. So we definitely want to resize this. We can do that in the output properties by changing the values for the resolution. And I'm thinking a little bit vertical for this. There's also a value for the resolution. Grease pencil is actually vector-based, so you could make a final image literally as big as your heart desires. Now, to put our tree in the center of our camera, we can do that in this box, in View, and then in View Lock, we can check Lock Camera to View. And now, as we move around our scene, as we would move around typically in the 3D viewport, our camera moves with us. So I find that this is the easiest way to reposition our grease pencil painting within the frame of our camera. Pay attention to the 3D cursor at the world origin, because our camera will rotate around this point. So try to keep it in the center of the frame as much as possible. And then when you're happy, make sure to uncheck the camera to view box so that you don't accidentally move and lose your perfect scene. Now, we'll animate our camera using an empty. So, while we're in object mode, we can press Shift S and make sure our 3D cursor is at the world origin in case it's not. So we can press this button to make it at the world origin, and then we can press Shift A and add an empty of plane axes. As I understand them, empties in Blender are mainly used to perform operations on other objects. They are literally empty, nothing, and nothing will show up in your final render. So, in the scene collection, we can rename our empty Turn. And then we can select our camera, and then Control select our new empty, right click, and in Parent select Object. So in our timeline, let's go to frame 1. But right now, this timeline is only showing grease pencil keyframes. So if I select one of my grease pencil objects, we can see that each layer has a keyframe based on what frame I was in when I created it or first made a stroke on it. It may have happened while you were drawing that you accidentally ended up on a new frame without realizing it. And so all you would need to do is, if necessary, unlock the layers in the timeline, select on these keyframes, and with G, you can move them so that they are all at 1. With that out of the way, now we can press here and change the grease pencil timeline to the dope sheet. We no longer see the grease pencil keyframes, but this will allow us to animate the objects in our scene. So let's select our empty, and we'll make this box show our item transforms. Then at frame 1, we want to keyframe it exactly as it is, so we can do that by pressing I, then keyframe the rotation. So now, let's go to one frame after the end of our animation. So that would be frame 251 in this case. Then, in the item transforms, let's give the Z a rotation value of 360. Enter and hit I and keyframe the rotation again. Now if we scrub along the timeline, we see our tree rotate. But by default, Blender creates an animation that starts slow and ends slow and speeds up in the middle. And so in order to get a constant turnaround animation, all we need to do is right-click between the two keyframes, go to Interpolation mode, and select Linear. And now, we have a grease pencil bonsai that will just seamlessly keep looping forever. Then of course, we need to sign our beautiful creation. Let's go back to frame 1, and let's go into our mossball grease pencil object and create a new layer. Name it Signature. Then go into Top View, numpad 7, or by pressing on the Z, and shift right click to place the 3D cursor past the tree, close to the camera. Go back to camera view, into draw mode, Make the stroke placement 3D cursor and make sure the drawing plane is at view, and sign your name. I'll make the noise modifier not affect this layer, and then in relations, select the camera as your parent. And so now as the camera rotates, our signature does not move, and then reposition if you need to. So now, finally, to export it. We can do that back in the output properties, and so we'll keep the animation length 250 frames and the frame rate at 24 frames per second. You can press on this icon to choose which folder it will be exported into. And then in my experience, a grease pencil painting like this really shouldn't take too long to export. So we can just export it directly to video. So make the file format FFmpeg video, and then open up encoding and make the container MP4. And then we can hit Ctrl F12 and sit back as our animation exports. So after I finished filming, I looked at my tree a lot more and decided that I wanted to change up the colors a bit. I added a background color by going into the world properties and changing the background color here. And I also went into render properties, opened up color management at the bottom, and played around with the curves, just tweaking them a bit here and there until I got something I was more a fan of. We did it! That is awesome. I would love to know how this tutorial went for you and to see your bonsai if you're comfortable sharing it. Liking and subscribing, and especially sharing this video around, would be a huge help. Thank you so much for all of the support, and I hope that my channel has been helpful for you. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can find me on all of the internet at Sophie Jantak. And if you're an Instagram kind of person, that's where I post all of my work, both Blender related and otherwise. All of that will be linked below. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you very soon. Bye.